Okay, so it's March 25th. This is the Kubernetes Cassandra SIG meeting. Patrick is double booked at the moment, so I'm going to be emceeing today. So welcome. Figure we could get things started with some updates from the community, see how things are going. Sorrel or Umair, do you have anything that you wanted to pop into before we start going through like commits and stuff that have been landing?
Nothing on my end, just here to observe and catch up.
Cool. Sorrel?
You said zero?
Yeah, I was wondering if you had anything that you wanted to...
Yeah, I heard. I wasn't sure that was my name. No, nothing on my end. Just discussions back and forth with Jim and John, but not much. I was able to, one thing, I was able to test multi-cluster setup using the new fix for the additional seeds using those names. I mean names instead of IPs. So yeah, so I'm using that one in a test that I have in the repo, and it's working well.
So that brings up an interesting point. So I've seen that's landed in CAS operator master branch. Jim, do you know, and John, do you know of anything else that we'd want to wrap up into another release of CAS operator? Or a timeline for something like that landing?
There's at least like 3 things I think I would have thought someone would want to get merged, and I feel like I've poked a couple of them and haven't kind of moved. So it doesn't have to be something else, but I'll look. If we want to release just this, we should probably just be a point release. Like there's no, this is just like a behavior change that's good, but like no API is different anywhere.
So we wouldn't even need to roll minor.
We could roll a patch, roll a patch version forward. Just like host names are legal and some string where only IPs were legal before is the last thing I think we merged.
Okay.
There's a couple other, at least a couple other changes that have landed in master that I think we'd like to see released. One for the adding labels and annotations to the services. And then I want to say there was another one.
That's the stuff. I don't think that got merged, or like I think it was either in the last release or it hasn't gotten merged. Because I'm looking and there's only since we released 1.6 a month ago today. There's the change Michael made that we were just talking about, and then Chris made some nice doc changes. That's what I'm saying. There's a bunch of stuff that's sort of like, I don't know. I know like not everyone can merge, but I know you can, John, and I gave you that. I gave you the authorization or whatever for a reason. So maybe it's just we need to be better about who needs to hit the button.
Okay, maybe miscommunication, and I'll circle back on those viewers. Okay.
Yeah, I generally like, just want to see somebody be like, yeah, where it's all good, like this is ready to go. You know what I mean? Like, and sometimes I see like you have some questions when you reviewed the PRs. I'm like, well, I'm not gonna like end this prematurely if someone's still doing some work. Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. We could probably clean up a couple of things, or we could cut a patch release soon, whichever is kind of more helpful.
I want to thank Michael Berman for the PR he made.
Yeah, he's got that one and a couple others. So yeah, he's making some pretty nice contributions for sure.
Great. And the docs changes that I had put in there apply to the previous version, or do they apply to 1.6.02? I guess it's not required that they get rolled. I mean, they would be included. But that's not a motivating factor there for me. It's just, does it show up in GitHub, right? Okay. Is there anything else going on with CAS operator that we want to get into, or any changes or PRs or tickets that should be discussed here?
One dangling thing I haven't had time to look at in a while, but I think we're like, we should probably test and push out like a bundle for Kubernetes 1.20. We did 119 fairly promptly because a bunch of people asked, but nobody's asked for 1.20. I'm assuming it's just because like I think that came out at like the end of last year. So maybe people were just sort of not dialing into new projects or whatever. I don't know. Or maybe we only heard about 1.19 because I think something didn't work. So it was like, hey, what's going on? And maybe 1.20 just works. But anyway, I think we should clean up the current version support stuff because yeah, like I think the last time we bumped out some old versions was like 4 months ago and I was overdue. So like kind of like churn out some old. I really don't know how many we should try to target. We're on the very high end, I've found. A lot of things are only going to support 1, maybe 3 versions of Kubernetes at all, even in like the docs as a call out. And we had like 6 or 7 for a while.
So we should get 1.20 added to that matrix that generates
Yeah.
those YAML files, and also make
Yep.
sure it gets tested.
Yeah.
I'll get an issue started for that today. I'd like to call attention to ticket number 396. I'll put it in the chat. Sign up per pod configuration. And it's an interesting problem to solve. And obviously, like, given the ticket here, there is a use case for it. But I kind of wanted to get a feel of the parties involved here, and maybe start some discussion around what maybe that could look like, and maybe what you've seen in other projects that you've enjoyed or not enjoyed. And Jim, it looks like you had a very visceral reaction to like to the thought of this. So I'm curious for some feedback there.
Well, I'm not the Cassandra expert. I think this is a very un-Kubernetes-ish thing, but it seems like Cassandra, you know, human operators, administrators need this. So I'm curious what Cyril or Umair.
Yeah, I actually do have some thoughts on this. So this is actually a limitation with Kubernetes, right? Well, I shouldn't say necessarily with Kubernetes, depending on how you use it. But in our practice, we generally will deploy things out as a stateful set, and by definition, a stateful set is going to have the same image that it deploys and the same, config maps or whatever, all the same environment variables. So doing any sort of per pod configuration using the stateful set primitives is not going to work. So we have actually had a use case for this, not actually with Cassandra per se, but things like Couchbase or Elasticsearch, where we have where we might want to have a specific, like a dedicated master, for example, or enable certain services for just some pods in the cluster. So like in Couchbase, you might have like the indexing service on a couple of the nodes, but the search service on a couple of the other nodes. So there are use cases for this. For Cassandra, it's probably less. I mean, obviously somebody opened a ticket, so there's probably a use case for it. But so what we found, really the only way to kind of accomplish that is to build your own construct on top of something like a stateful set. So you basically are going to require a CRD. And what we've kind of been looking at is sort of a stateful set, if you will. So like a set of stateful sets that might just kind of a wrapper. It's a collection of stateful sets that can get deployed, and then each individual stateful set can have its own configurations and image if it needs to. But yeah, so those are my thoughts around it.
So it sounds like another primitive could be used to handle that, and maybe you have X of your nodes are one stateful set that have Y configuration, and then
Yeah. I mean, to be honest with you, in a CAS operator, what you could do is you could actually just deploy out multiple stateful sets, right? In CAS operator. In a way, I think CAS operator, or I can't remember which operator it was, but in my a few meetings ago that I was here, I know there's some notions of like topologies and where things might have some sort of rack or DC associated with them. That in a way is kind of this per pod configuration, right? If you think of multi data centers or multi rack awareness per pod, that is a per pod configuration.
okay.
Yeah. So yeah, per rack and some of these like different groupings like are already really pretty well supported, but the per pod stuff is like in the same rack. I want to assign like all the token. I want to assign like single tokens ahead of time. So like the first pod in the rack gets token 1, the next one gets token like 1 billion, the next one gets token 10 billion, and so on, whatever. So when we made this stuff, it was like, oh, we'll handle this. Like people should like who really wants to be doing that? So we won't make them. But it's come up several times like, oh, I really want to do this because I guess I'm used to it outside of Kubernetes, which I understand. So that's kind of like the crux of some of this is like, do we need this? Like, I don't think so, but someone else will think we do, and it's fine. Like, I think we found more and more ways to get it wedged in. It's just sort of like very. It's like there's like multiple shims needing to be stacked up to support this. Yeah, because of exactly what you said. Like the stateful set, like Kubernetes just does not want you to do this. Like if you're adding this feature, you're like doing something like giving your pod the ability to use the Kube API or kind of moving data around with like labels or annotation. I have seen a couple projects use annotations for such things. Although it's not really for per pod configuration, I'd say. I saw Argo uses annotations to like sort of like scratch space in some similar way.
Let me tell you how we allow users to do something like this. So the way we do it in Cascade operator is we allow scripts to be added as a pre-run before Cassandra. And this is something that we use, or post-run, but this is something that we use, for example, if we need to replace one node. Maybe there wasn't a way to do it dynamically, so we needed to add something to do it. What we do is we just have a script that runs, and the script just says, if host name is this, you do this one, otherwise you don't do anything. That could also be something that would be done through a pod preset where you add something to a specific pod based on labels, annotations, or something. And then when the pod starts, it will say, okay, is there something that I need to run or to check or to test? And that will be done. That's the only way we found, I think, to do, to make pods behave differently. And it only depends on usually on their host name. So we just decide that this host name does this action and that's it. And we could do the same with tokens. So we could have a map and we check the name in the map and we do it. But this is the only way we found to do something like this. This is something that Tom used. Tom Offerman, yeah, that's what he used in his case.
I hit something similar trying to run. I was struggling with persistent volumes on OpenShift in my local environment, and I decided to just install the Rancher local path provisioner, and because I was used to that one with other Kubernetes distros. And one of the things that I found was how they handle their configuration with the config map. So I put a link to the relevant part of the README, but essentially the config map has like this config.json, which configures the provisioner program controller, whatever the heck you want to call it. But there is a second key that I thought was a lot more interesting. That was helperpod.yaml. And so this was used as the template for, I guess, the pod that is deployed alongside the, I don't know if it's the application or something else. It's used to actually configure permissions or something. I don't remember the exact details.
Yeah, the helper pod is making, it does the actual like mixer and like makes the volumes and stuff. Like,
Yeah, the command is, yeah, its job is to run busybox and call makedir. Yeah. So I thought that was kind of interesting that you could use a config map in that way. I don't necessarily want to make a config map per node, but I wonder if there is something that we could do along those lines where we said, not necessarily the YAML template. I just thought that was clever, but more of
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very similar to what Cyril was saying. Basically,
Yeah.
it looks like the node key is basically the host name there or something similar, right? And you just execute logic based on what your identity is.
Yeah, yeah, and I wonder if that could be used for scripts. In Cyril's definition, you could have a collection of scripts that are run. I also wonder if it would be possible to maybe pull in pieces of that JSON structure that are merged with pieces of the JSON structure that you use to build the actual Cassandra config. This is just a reference of something else that I had seen that I thought was kind of clever, because I was really fighting with it that one day when I was using OpenShift. It was not the right solution, but it was very ergonomic to just, oh, hey, I understand what goes inside of this part, this key inside the config map and how it applies. Okay, well, yeah, this is some great discussion. If you want to put some comments there in the ticket, that's super helpful. I'm curious to see where we end up going, but some fascinating discussion there. Any other issues anybody wants to bring up, or we want to switch gears? Okay. So there's a number of items that have gone into Cassandra. Some blog posts have been published out on the website there. But John, do you want to give us a rundown of what's been going on in the Cassandra project?
Let's see, a couple things. There's some bug fixes and changes around backup restore for fixing support for MinIO. There's some, I guess, some documentation in progress for that. And then also changes for so Medusa, I say using for local backups, meaning when you specify the storage for in Medusa configuration. One of the modes is local versus so writing to the file system versus S3, for example. And that's supported sort of ish because there's we don't have in 1.0 there's no support for in what Cassandra for where you can write those backups for persistent volume. And so with the changes that so there's a PR that I think was merged or it's in review that's utilizing changes from Cyril to add support for specifying additional PVs, so we can create a new PV for the backups, so improve that support. There's been a lot of discussion around and work going on around automated testing. Alex, who's not here, he's in France, has been spearheading that effort. And so there's been a lot of effort going at not just for CI as well as for just the developer experience, trying to make it where you can run tests in a the same way, meaningful tests. So we're actually standing up clusters. So I feel like there's been some really good progress there. And we're let's see. I think that's it. One of the things that I've been looking at is migrating to Cassandra, or in this really, I mean, some of it is kind of the focus on migrating the CAS operator actually. And so I decided from within the context of migrating within Kubernetes. So you already have Cassandra running in Kubernetes, maybe your hand-rolled solution, another operator, whatever. And so I've been spending some time with going through. I just decided to use the Bitnami Helm chart, and there's an interesting exercise. I'd be curious to know how people might prefer to handle that. I think the solution that going to document would be a data center switch. There's some challenges there in terms of the additional storage requirements and client service changes. So I was exploring trying to just reuse the volumes from my cluster that I created with the Bitnami chart, and found that it's possible, but there are a few more hoops that I had to jump through than I originally anticipated, and of course it requires some downtime. But I'm gonna write up a summary and hopefully put up a blog post on that on the Cassandra blog in the next week or two. I think that's it.
So I think it's also worth noting there's been some conversations and discussion. I think the write-up is linked out to GitHub issues. If not, we'll make sure that goes out in the notes for this call. But there's been a discussion around branching and merging strategy for long-term releases and making sure that it's done in a sane way. We're not kind of painting ourselves into the corner. That's been very verbose, even going so far as to show example Git commands. So I'm not going to. Thank you, John. I'm not going to go too far into the weeds there, but it's a fascinating read. And personally, I didn't know some of those Git commands, but I think there's new ones hopping in all the time. But just how to handle patch releases, major, minor version numbers, and that kind of work. So really fascinating work, and I think very thoughtful work. I think that was done over a number of sessions and feedback.
I just posted a link for discussion in the Cassandra GitHub repo around 4.0 features that we want to add support for. Some of them are some new configuration settings. So there'll be some changes we need to make in like the config builder image that Cas operator uses to provision the config settings. And then I think, and so then of course JDK 11 support. So looking at, so those are some things, updating images with the new GC, new garbage collectors. And then there's a interesting one, I think, around audit and the full query logging, adding support there. And again, so I can see where leveraging the support for specified additional PVCs would come in handy for that. But so wanted to point that out, because if anyone has any thoughts around any changes or things that are specific that are going to be landing in 4.0 that think are relevant in this context, be great to get your thoughts in this discussion.
I guess that leads to an interesting question: is are you currently evaluating 4.0 in your environments? Are you waiting for some of the tooling to support it? What's the feel there? I guess that's a Numair or a Cyril question. Are you following along with the betas, or what? I guess what's your timeline for investigating 4.0 as a target?
It's funny because I was asked today about it. So I don't have any plans yet, but yeah, this is something we have under, on our radar. So I don't have any timeline yet, but yeah, this is something that we need to look at and check. And I was asked, if they could use Cassandra with version 4.0, or if they needed to look at Cascade. And I didn't have the answer for Cassandra. So if you start working on it, that's something that would be interesting to us as well.
It's worth noting that we hit a bunch of issues with the was it beta 3 and the management API, there were some protocol changes and stuff. So we've been laying some of the groundwork and putting in a lot of the fixes as the betas have been coming out. So I'd like to see a fast follow release, assuming the test pass and everything. I don't want to rush things, but to at least make sure that the tooling is available so that it can start to be evaluated in an easier way. Trying to think of what else was going on in that space. I'm struggling here. But it does appear as though 4.0 is right around the corner, though. So I'm personally very excited to see that land and make sure that we have the tooling in place to support it, both in CAS Operator and Cassandra. I guess one of the other things I'd like to look at is, I know that in Cassandra we do a lot of work around maintaining the map of images to version numbers and to explicitly call out which server image we want to use. And with CAS Operator, John, have we looked at bringing some of that upstream and getting the version maps updated in CAS Operator, or rethinking how version maps work in CAS Operator? Because I know it's been kind of painful in the past. Was it for anything greater than 3.11.7?
So I don't intend to deflect, but I have to actually defer to Jim, because I know that's something we've discussed, because I at one point opened up that Jim and I have discussed, and I had opened up a PR to update the version mappings, but I've since forgotten the reasons and motivations for not trying to push through the PR. And of course, so
yeah, I think we talked offline, some comments were on the PR too, but basically it was like, for what you wanted to do, you didn't need the PR, but I was fine with merging the PR anyway. Like it was valid, but it wasn't, I think maybe you needed like a couple more lines to like implement one more thing. But I was like, what do you really want? And it was like, you could just update the Docker image and get what you want.
Yeah, maybe. So
because we changed all this to work with regexes. Anyway, so on this subject, I would advise that we kind of cobble together the best we can and fix this in like a backwards incompatible way with version 2. Like you should just pass a Docker image. Done. Like there's so much code around managing this, and it just makes it like very vulnerable to like, oh, but now we're not backwards compatible because our default thing was to like check these 3 settings and then do something. We do need to know the semver for generating configuration, but that's not really the problem. It's all about like where and what Docker image we're getting. I think in the future, the user should just have to know exactly the Docker image they want. And we can just publish a bunch in docs and examples that are.
So here's where I have concern or questions around that. But does that put an extra burden on users? In Cassandra, we started creating more of a version matrix around the management API images. So we haven't seen it yet, but we found that you have versions for each Cassandra version. You may have different versions of the management API, and I think that there's we had discussion with the Cassandra team that maybe you want to have some image that's pointing to a tag that's pointing to the latest management API image for each Cassandra version, and if we have that, then maybe that simplifies it for users. But otherwise, does it I just wonder, does it make it more confusing for users to figure out? Maybe it's just a matter of documentation. I don't know.
So I agree that the documentation should be updated. The problem that I'm experiencing, or the pain that I feel, and please tell me if this isn't a real pain, is around the fact that we currently have a way for you to just type a version and get an image. And it sounds like the way we want to go is to remove that behavior, which is fine. But I still feel like anybody that's using pre 2.0, which I haven't seen what that looks like, my first thing to reach for is to say, okay, I want 3.11.10, the latest version of 3.11. So we'll just say 3.11.10, if that is a real version. And it doesn't behave the way I expect it to because it's not a version that CAS operator knows that it should play nice with. It like I as the user didn't know that I needed to specify that image value. We can make some of that better with our documentation and our samples. But it sounds like Jim, you're arguing that there's some diminishing returns there to poke at that code that's around, like, given this version number and this server type, this is the Docker coordinate you want to use. And then if you have like your own Docker registry, then you have to like prepend all that, and it sounds like it can get difficult. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, this is sort of like a not right now answer from me. Like, we do need something
Okay.
for the 1.0 versions that we have out there. That's like, but I'm just saying, like, I think after seeing this bounce around a lot, it's like I don't think there's like a perfect answer for this.
Okay. So something that I've been working on recently has been the OpenShift integration with CAS operator. It's lived in its own little branch for a while now, and that's through no fault of anyone here, to be clear. It's been following along though with as we've released versions, there have been updates that have come in. So the branch name, and I'll link this inside of Zoom chat, is Ko264 Olm Integration. So this harkens back to the Jira days. There we go. Oh, for some reason, Cyril, I just sent that to you. There we go. There's the rest of the group. So this branch has been following along fairly closely, and it follows the new Operator Hub model of using bundles of service versions. Or cluster service versions is the name of the custom resource. The reason that you use these things with OpenShift is it gives you a nice, pretty UI it does like a few things. It'll let you automatically update your operator, but it also gives you a UI to create Cassandra data centers. I've personally tested it through CAS operator version 1.5.1. For some reason, when I went to 1.6.0, I got into a really weird edge case where the container would try to come up, the management API would try to come up, but the mount point for varlib Cassandra did not have the right permissions on it, and thus I couldn't actually start Cassandra. So this is something that I'm still working on. I'd like to see it get merged at some point, hopefully with 1.6 testing completed, which is not done yet. We can actually get this merged into the mainline, because it's mostly just a collection of Docker files and YAML files, that not real big code changes at all. Zoom chat is the directory where most of the changes exist. But the nice thing about this is if you're running on OpenShift, you can just say, hey, install CAS operator. It'll install it, and you'll have an interesting UI for creating the custom resource, the Cassandra Data Center custom resources. So I'll hopefully have more to update there here in the near future. All right. So additionally, as we get towards, so KubeCon is coming up the first week of May, and there are some initiatives for KubeCon. One of the things I'd love to see is, assuming Cassandra 4.0 has launched before KubeCon, I'm hoping that we can have that support for that version in CAS operator and Cassandra. Again, that's assuming that it launches in a reasonable time and we can get it through testing and fixes in place. But the other thing that we're looking at, John Sanda mentioned integration testing, building that out. Even a step further, we're looking to build out integration tests across a number of cloud Kubernetes vendors, and that will all be entry, so you can see both the tests and the automation to spin those environments up if you want to test them in your org. We're also spinning some cycles to build out documentation for deployment into those particular environments. So if you're deploying on GKE, I'm looking for a documentation experience where you can say, hey, I'm using GKE, at which point your Medusa recommendations center on backing up to GCS instead of to S3. If you want to look at ingress, we can look at specific ingress solutions for that particular vendor. And so part of that is going on right now, both the automation to spin up clusters in those environments to run the integration test, but also the documentation. I expect to see some more commits to the documentation there in the coming weeks, and we'll have some updates and hopefully get some the team that's working on that to join the SIG calls and provide some status updates there. So more on that soon. And finally, it's just worth noting that we released back in earlier in March, we started setting up a Cassandra blog, which is available at cassandra.io/blog. And it covers a number of topics. That is not the URL without the plus sign on the end. There we go. This is actually open for contribution by anyone. So right now, the blog is entry as part of the docs section to the blog folder, but we're looking to expand this platform out and make it a little bit easier for people to publish. So if you're interested in partnering and building some of this content and talking about running Cassandra on Kubernetes, it doesn't necessarily have to be Cassandra related. It's really Cassandra on Kubernetes is the focus there. Let us know, and we'd love to work with you. Awesome. Any other topics anybody wants to go into? Are we in a good spot for today?
One other item. So in the context of we were testing last week, people working in Cassandra and particularly with backup restore and finding that restarts were slow. And Jim pointed out a ticket, I guess, that he created a while ago for thinks there's an issue around the logging sidecar in CAS operator that might be delaying pod termination. And so I went down a rabbit hole last weekend trying to figure out what in the world is going on, and started learning some things about PID namespace, PID namespaces, and different things. Also learned that the tail program does not respond to SIG term, so the net effect is the Cassandra pod in CAS operator is configured with a termination grace period of 120 seconds. Because when the logging sidecar is enabled, because it doesn't respond, and because of the some things that I don't fully understand, but if it handles SIG term, since it doesn't handle SIG term, it's not going to terminate until that grace period's up. And so we have a workaround that unfortunately it's requires a little more effort than I would like, but went through, tried testing a number of permutations that tried to maintain the simplicity that with the current implementation. But that if you disable there's a property in the spec, you can turn off the logging sidecar. And and if you have that disabled, you'll see that the pod terminations do happen much more quickly.
I'm curious, what is the workaround?
So there's using, was it Teeny, and a new image that will, hang on, I'll show you.
Does Teeny take over as PID1 and actually respect the SIG term?
Yeah. And that, but the unfortunate thing is requires, creating a new image for that. So a little bit more work more maintenance, but so hopefully we also had a similar issue. So this is specific, I guess, more with the Medusa container that's redeployed with Cassandra. And that's where we noticed it, because when I was convinced that there was an issue with the Medusa container because I'm seeing when we do testing restores, like, gosh, it's taking forever for these pods to delete and come back up. And I thought, well, I'm only seeing this when I'm testing backup restore, I'm only noticing it. So presumably it was something. And sure enough, there was no SIG term handler with the Medusa container, the script. But I also had to make another change. That alone wasn't sufficient. Had to use exec to make sure to basically the Python process to run that in the parent shell. So basically PID1. So it's two things there.
It's kind of fascinating. I think back to the MinIO. So we talked about adding MinIO support. MinIO support was a feature we were looking at, but that wasn't necessarily something that was actively being worked on. It was actually a bug fix for S3 compatible stores that enabled the MinIO support. It's kind of fascinating to see how some of these explorations turn into making other features just work out all of a sudden.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned this before, but we run all of our own custom images here. So we have, like, part of our spec for any image that we run is to use the exec form for any shell. So we basically have an entry point script that we always run, and that always will exec so that whatever takes over will be PID1. And we use dumb init. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the dumb init, but yeah. So yeah, signal handling can be fun to deal with.
Yeah, it just broke my brain that tail doesn't support SIGTerm. I would have just
Yeah,
assumed that it
that was yeah.
Excellent. All right, John, Jim, anything else you want to pop in here? Sounds like we're looking at a potential CAS operator release coming up for the additional seeds host name change, which is a welcome change. There was some discussion about adding additional seeds to the spec for Cassandra. Did we get a ticket? Is that something that we've done, or is there a ticket for that, John? I know there's been some interesting conversations around that.
We already have it. It's already been merged in
Okay.
Cassandra.
So it just needs to hit stable. It's sitting in Next already?
Yep.
Sweet. Awesome. Okay, so I guess the last thing that I wanted to bring up, we talked, I don't know if it was last week, I think it was last week, might have been the week before, about the Cassandra public roadmap. Anybody looking at that might have noticed that it has many of the, at least for Q1 and Q2, many of the items have been updated to be actual issues. I'm putting it in the link inside of Zoom now. Additionally, some of these issues seem kind of meta, but they have a number of checkbox lists inside that link to the tickets across the other organizations or repos, regardless of if they're in the Cassandra org. So we can kind of track the velocity there. But we are at the end of March, and there's a number of these that are still open. Some of them will carry on into Q2. Not too concerned there because this roadmap was created, digitized towards the end of this quarter anyway. But there is still some ongoing work to turn the rest of the plain text notes into more featureful tickets that we can then again have the labels and such. But appreciate any comments or feedback there or on the underlying tickets themselves. So thank you. Awesome. And I guess with that, it sounds like we're in a good spot. Thank you for joining the SIG call today. And I look forward to seeing you all again next time.